Great, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today on this cold, wintry, I guess it's December 1st, and it hit us with a bit of a vengeance. Apologies for that, for the snow this morning. I'm Ed Schatz. I'm the director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at the Munk School, Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. And along with the Munk School and the government of Luxembourg, we at CERES are absolutely delighted to welcome Yuriko Backes, Luxembourg's finance minister, and the first woman in Luxembourg's history to hold that post. In a moment, you'll hear from my colleague, Professor Alexander Reisenbichler, about more fully about her illustrious career to date. But to my knowledge, today's event marks the first time, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, that we've hosted anyone from the government of Luxembourg. Does that sound about right? But I do hope this is the first of many visits and many more conversations, because as it turns out, there is quite a lot to talk about. Our center, the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, has a broad remit. We cover everything geographically from Lisbon and Cork in the west to Vladivostok and Kamchatka in the east, down to Termez and Chorog in the south. And that's a lot of ground to cover, but the interconnections across this vast space are legion, and they are growing. And as Russia's war in Ukraine underscores, some of these interconnections introduce vulnerabilities and insecurities that we'd rather not experience, but all of these interconnections, the ones we welcome and the ones that we regret that we face, deserve our close attention. Today, we're happy to be joined by Alexander Reisenbichler as well, assistant professor at the University of Toronto here and an expert on the political economy of Europe. Alex also directs our joint initiative in German and European studies at CERES, a Munk School, and Alex has the honor of introducing Minister Backes. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. The minister will speak for 25, 30 minutes. Does that sound about right? Okay. And then we'll have a bit of Q&A, but the minister would be delighted to take additional questions and hold additional conversation at a reception that we'll retire to after the brief Q&A that we'll have here. Okay, so look forward to conversation both formally here and informally at the reception afterwards. Over to you, Professor Reisenbichler.
Thank you very much, Professor Schatz, Ed. And I'd like to first welcome Finance Minister Backes, Consul General Steinmetz, as well as the delegation from Luxembourg. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today for the Finance Minister's important lecture on the state of economic affairs in Europe. Now, Europe is facing what some have called a permacrisis or polycrisis, which is a set of intertwined, complex, and seemingly never-ending crises that are challenging the very foundation of Europe and the European Union. In recent years, the European Union has been hit by one crisis after another, most recently by Russia's war in Ukraine and related soaring energy prices and inflation, an ongoing pandemic, as well as geo-economic tensions to the east and west of the continent, and the list goes on. But even though doomsayers were quick to predict the demise of the European Union, thus far, the EU has shown remarkable adaptability and resilience. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, the Finance Minister of Luxembourg, Ms. Yuriko Backes, who will lecture on how the European Union has responded to this crisis, or to this state of permanent crisis, rather, in Europe. Ms. Backes is Luxembourg's first female Minister of Finance, a position she has held since January of this year, as part of a coalition government between the Democratic Party, the Luxembourg Socialist Workers' Party, and the Green Party under Prime Minister Xavier Bettel. As Finance Minister of Luxembourg, which is of course one of the 6 founding members of the European Union, she is also a key member of important decision-making bodies in the European Union. These include ECOFIN, which brings together the economy and finance ministers of all EU member states, who then decide on economic and financial affairs. And it also includes the Eurogroup, an influential group that coordinates the Eurozone's economic policies. Prior to her post as finance minister, Ms. Backes was a career diplomat and held several high-level positions with Luxembourg's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including a post as the representative of the European Commission in Luxembourg. She was also a diplomatic advisor to Prime Minister Bettel, as well as his predecessor, Jean-Claude Juncker, whom many of you, of course, also know as the former president of the European Commission. Moreover, Ms. Backes has earned a BA from the LSE, an MA from SOAS, both in London, and a second MA from the College of Europe in Bruges. So her personal and professional backgrounds very much represent a true European story and journey. And today we are very privileged to get some firsthand insights from a distinguished politician of one of Europe's largest financial centers, who will talk about the European Union in a world of permacrisis. So everybody, please welcome me in joining the Finance Minister of Luxembourg, Ms. Yuriko Backes.
Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. Dear students, dear members of faculty also, and other people here interested in having a conversation and spending a little bit of time together. I'm really very happy to be able to be at this very prestigious university, widely ranked as #1 in Canada. Monk School is also very well known in Europe, and thank you for organizing this exchange together also with the Ceres Center. And I hope with this talk and with this exchange, I can also reinforce your interest in Europe and in the European Union. For me, it's great to be back in Canada. It's been really way too long since I've been here last time. I'm very sorry that Canada is now out of the World Cup, which I've been sort of following on the side of lots of meetings. Belgium is also out of the World Cup. Very sorry. Some of my colleagues are very sad about that. This is as close as Luxembourg gets to being in the World Cup. But relations between also Luxembourg and Canada are very important. I want to highlight that as well. Prime Minister Bettel, you mentioned him. He was in Canada just very recently in November in Ottawa and Montreal. He also met with Prime Minister Trudeau. Canada and Luxembourg are allies and go back, this alliance goes back many years. It's really also very historical connection. I want to point out by way of introduction that the Grand Duchess, our head of state at the time, and the government were in exile in Canada at the beginning of World War II, and the fact that they were able to be here and also be close to the US, but really live here in exile, also guaranteed us being an independent country after the Second World War. So this historical connection is today still very important. Economic relations also, we had our Minister for the Economy who also led a delegation to Canada as recently as June. Trade, innovation, many connections there, but even beyond that, there's collaboration in the space industries. So I just want to point that out because not only on the political side, but also on the economic side and even cultural relations, very important. Many bilateral agreements between Canada and Luxembourg, also in the audiovisual sector, for example. So we have a lot of things in common. We are both members of G7. Okay, I can hear somebody reacted, so I can tell that you're listening. No, of course we're not. Canada is part of G7. We're still aspiring G7 members. Multilateral engagement is extremely important for Canada, also for Luxembourg. We are part of the Francophonie. You are, we are. We also, both countries have a feminist foreign policy. I think Canada was one of the first ones to to go down that road and to make feminism, which is a bit of an aggressive word. I don't like it so much, even though I'm a feminist, but it's a word I don't like so much. But the feminist foreign policy is also something that the government of Luxembourg has subscribed to. So another thing we have in common. And well, it was mentioned, I'm the first female finance minister of Luxembourg. Canada also has a female finance minister. So there's two of us out of, I don't know if you want to guess how many female finance ministers there are in the world. Anybody? About 200 countries. Yeah. 27 today, 27 female finance ministers. So there's still some room for improvement. So we arrived in Toronto yesterday, have had very good meetings today, and we'll have more meetings tomorrow morning, really also to promote financial sector relations between our countries. Luxembourg is a big financial sector, as you mentioned. We do have presence of financial institutions of Canada in Luxembourg. It's rather limited, but that's why I'm also here. Canada is one of the EU's closest partners. And also there we share a lot of values, democratic principles, human rights, fundamental freedoms, common commitment to rules-based international world order is very important to both sides of the Atlantic. The CETA agreement, I think it's now 5th anniversary of that. I think it hasn't been ratified by all stakeholders, all countries yet. Luxembourg has ratified the agreement, but I think most of it is already in place without having been ratified by all contracting parties, which has already contributed also to trade between the EU and Canada. I want to tell you that the EU is part of the DNA of Luxembourg. The EU was born out of the war, and the idea behind it was really to create an interconnection, an economic interconnection between the countries, 6 founding countries. You mentioned Luxembourg was one of them, to create an interdependence and avoid countries going to war again. And of course, the 2 biggest economies in the EU, Germany and France, are at the origin of all of this. And guess who's stuck, I say it positively, between these 2 large economies is, of course, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. So with that, we were in Luxembourg really always at the beginning of everything that has happened in or led to the European Union. We had an economic union between Belgium and Luxembourg, which was also a precursor to the EU. We had a Benelux union, also in a way more political, but also precursor of the EU, leading then to the coal and steel community, which relates back to what I said, interconnecting economies to avoid going to war again. So Luxembourg was a founding member of all of these institutions. The institution of the EU, it's a bit of a particular setup. We don't see this in other countries. The European Commission is the institution that makes proposals for legislation that is then decided by member countries of the EU. Luxembourg has been giving 3 presidents of the Commission. So we have also been able to influence via the presidency of the Commission. The European Union has 3 capitals. Luxembourg is one of the 3 EU capitals. So we are host to, for example, the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Auditors, the European Investment Bank. I'm sure you have hopefully you've had contact with the European Investment Bank, Public Prosecutor's Office. So we are the seat of many EU institutions. and have a very vibrant, well, also civil servant sector besides being an international financial sector. So Luxembourg's domestic market is essentially a single market of 450 million people, which is of course also influenced the way we see the economy, the way we see the future also of the European Union, also in economic terms, evolving. The euro is today the second largest currency in the world, 20 years old now. And also there, Luxembourg, or former Luxembourg Prime Minister Pierre Werner was really the spiritual founder of the euro. Also having contributed to that. And of course, during all these years leading up to today, member states comprising the European Union have given up some of their sovereignty to be able to pool that on a higher level. But the Economic and Monetary Union, the EMU, I'm sure you are following this also, is something that's incomplete. We have a monetary union, but national economic policies and fiscal policies are still decisions that are taken by member states, by governments. For myself, then, it was mentioned, being part of the Eurogroup and ECOFIN, we of course exchange on this, but it's not the European Union who will be responsible for making the budget of Luxembourg. That is my job. So I want to tell you that the EU has been largely shaped by external events, global events, in a way always shaped in the face of adversity. And it's still the case today. And I think we will be measured by how we respond also to today's crisis, but also how we have responded to a past crisis. And this will determine how our future economies and also our societies will develop. You have mentioned permacrisis or polycrisis. It does seem that we're in a permanent state of crisis, from the economic or sovereign debt crisis to the successive refugee crisis. Sometimes we forget about terrorism, but also that we shouldn't forget. Also there we had to work together. But what I want to tell you is that from my point of view, every crisis that we have seen in the world, but here I'm talking about the European Union, the first reflex was always a national responses to the crisis. How do we deal with this nationally? And in the end, we saw that all of these crises, really the solutions that were there, could not be found on a national level. Some yes, but most of them needed to be solved and still need to be solved on a European level. I mentioned the sovereign debt crisis triggered by the global financial crisis. Everybody went to save their banks. Everybody tried to find, every country tried to find national solutions. But in the end, what needed to be done was to find solutions on the European level. The European Stability and Growth Pact was created. We need to have, and we still do this today, coordinate our fiscal and budgetary policies. This is very important. After the last financial crisis, we created the ESM. It's a rescue fund that helps provide loans to Eurozone countries that are in fiscal distress. And perhaps you followed the news recently, a new Director General of the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, was appointed recently. And it's my predecessor, former Finance Minister Pierre Gramegna, who will be taking up this post on the 1st of December, which is today. Yeah. I must remember to send him a message. We have worked on the banking union, a common rule book, common architecture also for supervision and resolution. So what I want to tell you, with this sovereign debt crisis, the solutions that we were able to come up with later, also to try to prevent another crisis, were all on the European level. I mentioned the refugee crisis without going into detail, but also there, the reflex was, well, let's close borders. As the wave of refugees from Syria was coming through Europe, some countries really automatically closed their borders. Others were more helpful. And again, here, the solution was a European one. We need to help out. We need to be solidaire. What we then try to do is divide up between quotas in a way, helping to take up some of these people who are really running away from a terror regime. Again, solutions had to be found on a European level. We all went through a pandemic, slowly coming out of it. The whole world was affected. We all experienced lockdowns. And also there in Europe, as we were going into this pandemic, the immediate reactions were very often national again. Also there, we saw countries closing borders. Now, when you come from a small country like Luxembourg, we have 200,000 people coming into our country every day, cross-border workers. So what happens when a neighboring country closes the border? You have 200,000 people who cannot get to work. On the one side, on the other side, lots of these people were actually our nurses or also working in the public health sector. So this is really, really dramatic. It almost seemed like we were back to World War II kind of reactions. This was very quickly solved, of course, but just to tell you again that also here in the pandemic, this national reflexes really led nowhere. We needed to again find solutions on the European level. And of course, during the pandemic, really unprecedented levels of support were decided on the national level. But beyond that, what we did, common vaccine purchases, it doesn't make sense for countries to do this on a national level. This was then done on a European level. We helped each other out across borders. When we had space in Luxembourg hospitals, we took in patients from across the border and vice versa. So you did see a very big movement of solidarity to help each other out during the pandemic. Also on an EU level, state aid rules were made more flexible during the pandemic. Fiscal rules were suspended. They are still suspended today. We had a program to protect and save jobs, the SURE program. Also that we decided on EU level. We created a program called Next Generation EU, which was actually something very new also for the EU, where we had joint debt issuance program. So grants and loans for countries, if they completed certain milestones, that they then can access grants or loans based on a common debt issuance program. So again, solutions were found on an EU level. And I think what the EU has been able to do is also learn from past mistakes. Rather than focus during the pandemic on austerity measures, also like was done during the debt crisis, what we tried to do with the successive budgets, of course, this was my predecessor who did a very good job with that, is to do qualitative and growth enhancing investments rather than austerity, and to really continue to invest in the dual transition, green transition, digital transition, rather than focus on how can we save money and lead a more austere budgetary policy. Now we are again in a war situation. I think it's exactly 9 months and about a week since Russia invaded the Ukraine. Absolute tragedy, of course, for the Ukraine. It's a tragedy for the people living there, but it's a tragedy way beyond that. We see how interconnected the world is. We see how a war in Europe has such far-reaching consequences. This war in Europe has triggered a triple crisis. It has triggered a global food crisis. It has triggered a global energy crisis, and it has also triggered a global, cost of living crisis. Again, some of the immediate reactions in countries also in Luxembourg or surrounding Luxembourg was how can we deal with the situation nationally? How are we going to make sure we get Russian gas that we may be so dependent upon? And again, here we saw rather quickly that we cannot address this very well on a national level. And yes, of course, every country took national measures. We did that, of course, in Luxembourg as well. But we needed to see on an EU level, how do we negotiate with the third countries to secure energy supply, how to diversify energy supply. We do this every country on their own, not so successful. Of course, this is also done, but we would be much more successful to do this on an EU level. We need to invest in renewables. We need to invest in energy efficiency. So again, here, also reducing consumption. We have also issued EU level guidelines on reducing energy consumption, which was a very important message also to all the consumers, not only on a national level, but EU-wide. As a result of the war that Russia is waging on Ukraine and the impact it really has globally, we are seeing really an economic downturn. Many countries, we are witnessing very, very high inflation, also in Canada, also in the Eurozone. And we are seeing global tensions. The geopolitical situation is very tense. And I really think here the EU and Canada, but let's also say together with the US, really have a common responsibility in facing all these crises that I have mentioned. Towards Russia, we have imposed sanctions very quickly, very wide-ranging and deep sanctions, absolutely necessary. Of course, the European economy is more impacted as a result of these sanctions and more exposed than Canada or the US. So we are feeling this very hard on our economy. But these sanctions are absolutely indispensable. We need to be on the right side of history. And like I said, the EU, Canada, we have a joint responsibility to carry out these sanctions, to maintain these sanctions, but also to help Ukraine. Canada is very, very active in providing support to the Ukraine, financial and otherwise. The Ukraine will need it. And the reconstruction, of course, of the Ukraine is going to be extremely expensive. There will need to be some kind of a Marshall Plan at some point. This is already being discussed now. And I think there also the EU, Canada, together with the US, really have a joint responsibility. China is another topic that I think is very d'actualité, very sensitive, very complicated. Human rights is an issue. Some of the economic decisions China is taking, also sitting on the sidelines and watching what is happening with Russia's aggression on the Ukraine, quite problematic. But I think also there, together, the EU with its partners, Canadian and US partners, has a responsibility in maintaining very strong relations with China, because China can and should and really must help de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine. And we need China for other things that are, I think, very important to Canada, but also to the EU, which is climate change. Climate change is still the most existential threat to our planet. And I think there we have very common vision of what should be done to direct also our economies towards net zero. And also there, Luxembourg as a financial center, I think has a role to play. We need to direct finances there where we can also secure and have an impact in the transition towards a greener and more sustainable future. Perhaps the last point I want to mention is free trade. And I think also there, I mentioned CETA before, but the EU and Canada and the US also have a joint responsibility. We don't want to go down the road of more protectionism. We are again in an economic crisis. The reflex is national. We are observing protectionist reflexes also in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a cause of concern in the EU. Subsidies that are promoting green transition should not blind us to this potentially having a very detrimental effect on some EU industries. Whether these subsidies are compatible with the WTO rules, I think is a matter of discussion. But what really we don't want to see is a return to protectionism. In Europe also, we have discussions about the EU's Open Strategic Autonomy Program is also not innocent to some protectionist philosophy. From Luxembourg point of view, we're a small open economy. We will always insist on the open part of this open strategic economy. We don't want to build a fortress Europe. We find this would be very detrimental to our interests, but also to global trade. So this is another area where I think we have a joint responsibility in making sure that we work together in the right direction, promote free trade and not go backwards with protectionist reflexes. Coming back to EU decision-making between 27 member countries, you can imagine that this is not always easy. This can be very frustrating. Of course, it's our form of democracy. It can take longer to find agreement between 27 member countries. What we don't have is sort of executive decisions that you see in other countries. We don't have that. So it takes longer. But in the end, I think really it's the ownership of the decisions that we do take that is very important. On the finance ministers level, we meet once a month, mostly in Brussels, but 3 times a year. The council also meets in Luxembourg. So we meet in Eurozone formation, and then we meet between 27 finance ministers. And the coordination of these policies is very important. Of course, we have very different economic fundamentals. Inflation, for example, within the European Union, we have some countries with inflation levels of 6-7%, which is also the case. Luxembourg is perhaps 7% right now, to some Scandinavian countries having a more than 20% inflation. So you have very big discrepancy on that. But we have all now, as a result of the economic downturn and the energy crisis and lots of other products also increasing with inflation, taken measures in our countries to help the most vulnerable households in our society. And Luxembourg is a very rich country, but also in Luxembourg, we have vulnerable people that we need to support, and we do. We have also taken lots of measures to help companies get out of or get out better, especially companies mostly impacted by high energy prices, to help them get through the current economic downturn. The measures that we have taken since I'm in government, only since January, it's been very costly. 3.3% of GDP is what the support package that we have taken, successive packages that we have taken this year has cost the budget. So you can imagine this is what my finance minister colleagues sometimes say. Being finance minister is one of the loneliest jobs in the world. There's a lot of pressure to do lots of wonderful things and public spending to help, like I said, most vulnerable people, to help companies get through this situation. But of course, government nowhere, I think, can do everything. It's simply impossible. My job is, of course, also to maintain sustainable public finances, not only think in terms of 6 months or 1 year, but to think in the long term. Luxembourg is a AAA country. We have inscribed in our coalition government agreement that we are keeping debt with respect to GDP below 30%. The Maastricht criteria say 60%, so we're staying well beyond below that. The Eurozone average is about 100%, so we're very much below that. I think Canada, but correct me if I'm wrong, is also more than 100% debt with respect to GDP, maybe 115%, but you would know better than me, just to give you a bit of a comparison. I will conclude now, and to also get a little bit your feedback. I'm very happy to take some questions, but more than questions, also to have, if you want, give me a little bit your analysis of the situation and your feedback of how you see this polycrisis or permacrisis situation from this side of the Atlantic, from the Canadian perspective. But I want to conclude with a quotation from the 1950s, Robert Schuman, who was a Luxembourg-born French statesman, who said, and I quote, "Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which create a de facto solidarity." And this is exactly what I have tried to illustrate. It's really the concrete achievements that we have been able to realize as a result of successive crises that I think have gotten us to the point where we can be as successful as we can in a new crisis situation, but also the solidarity, which is really the essence of our European project. Jean Monnet, another founding father of the European Union, and I quote him as well, said, "Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises." Very relevant still today, and yet this was said more than 70 years ago, so still very d'actualité again. For me, the EU is really the most successful peace project in history. It's also an unfinished peace project, and it's also not a perfect peace project. Nothing's perfect. I think perfection doesn't exist. Human beings are not perfect, so this will never be perfect. But I'm from Luxembourg. I am a proud Luxembourger, but also a very proud European. The motto, one of the mottos of the European Union is being united in diversity. We have a huge diversity in the European Union, but I think this is also an advantage. Of course, when you're trying to make decisions in crisis situations, it's not always an advantage, but fundamentally, I think the way we are able to live in Europe united in this diversity, diversity of 27 member states, diversity of cultures, diversity of languages, diversity of history still makes us, you know, in the end, come together and take the decisions that we need to take to deal with the crisis. So for those who have not been to the EU, or for those who have not been to Luxembourg, I invite you to visit us, especially also the students. We are at the university here. This is where talent is made in universities. That's why I'm very, very happy to be speaking here today. We need talent everywhere. You need talent in Canada. We look for talent in Luxembourg and in the European Union. And I think our governments are constantly trying also to promote the connections between universities. Also mobility between young people is so important. Like I said, this is where the talent is. Future jobs, be they in sustainable finance, which is the future, be it in fintech, which is the future, is what we try to promote and also attract in Luxembourg. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions. And if you have very difficult questions for me, I will pass them on to my colleagues. I'm kidding. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Finance Minister, for your excellent talk and for giving us a realistic and also optimistic view of the future of the European Union, which is something that is frequently lost in all the gloom and doom that we read in the news every day. So what we're going to do now is open up the floor to questions, and I'm going to exercise my right of asking the first one as moderator, and then we can call on the audience members here as well as the audience members online, and this is how we will proceed. Now, okay, so my question picks up on three things that you mentioned in your talk, and I'm going to try to combine it into one question, which is it relates to the incompleteness of the Eurozone on the one hand, and also your commitment to keeping debt levels low, and then also on the Next Generation EU fund that has set a precedent for joint borrowing in the Eurozone at a relatively unprecedented scale, of course. And so my question is, since I think that the Next Generation EU fund has been a tremendous step forward in terms of European economic integration, yet it was also a temporary step forward. So my question is, do you think that more joint borrowing along the lines of the EU Recovery Fund should be done in the future? And do you think it will be done in the future? Because I also read, of course, that your colleague, the German Finance Minister, Christian Lindner, is not very happy about such proposals. And then second, more ambitiously perhaps, do you think that this opened the door for something like a real safe asset in the Eurozone, something like a Euro bond that would be behind the Eurozone?
Thank you. Excellent questions. I will give you a very honest answer. I'm rather skeptical. Next Generation EU and the joint borrowing that you mentioned, I think this was really very good in the current circumstances, because it's really adding towards an ownership that we need. We have joint borrowing, member states set their programs. There are targets that need to be met in order to be able to profit from grants and loans. So it's an excellent exercise, really, of countries really feeling ownership with this program, but cannot, do anything. They need to meet targets in order to access this funding. I think it's excellent. Luxembourg is profiting from this also a little bit on a much smaller scale. Of course, other countries, Spain and other countries, larger countries, are very much benefiting from this. But to answer your question, if this is now going to be used more widely on a larger scale, I'm rather skeptical. But I think let's see how this program works out now. I think we need to do the lessons learned from that. But this is only really now the beginning of next generation EU, because this all doesn't go so quickly. You need to set up the plans. Every country needs to set up the projects that they want to have financed. Lots of controls. It's also sometimes rather bureaucratic, so it doesn't work as quickly as perhaps we would like. But of course, this is necessary because this also needs to be controlled. This is finally taxpayers' money, and the control mechanisms behind are also very important. Eurobond is not something new. This was something that was also thrown into a discussion by former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Jean-Claude Juncker, together with Trichet, I forgot. But I don't think at the current juncture Europe is ready for that. I'm just being very realistic, but it's not something that in the future should be impossible. Thank you.
Excellent. I had actually one question that I saw online, and let me paraphrase this one to some degree. So the dependence on importing Russian gas has, of course, exposed a lot of vulnerabilities in European energy relations, right? That those relations can be weaponized. Now, as you mentioned in your talk also, Europe is very much dependent on China and trade with China. And so the question online was, how can we make sure that, history doesn't repeat itself with, not being so exposed to these kinds of vulnerabilities that we've seen with Russia with regard to China?
Thank you very much. Another excellent question. I think we have seen how quickly the dependency on Russian energy, especially Russian gas, has gone down in a couple of months and weeks, from 40% to less than 10%. So you have seen, by way of necessity, a very quick decrease in this dependency. So what we have had to do very quickly is to go down the road of renewables. Of course, this is a trend that we have been trying to promote for many years, but now by way of necessity, we really need to speed along with that, also increase our energy efficiency, and like I mentioned earlier, finally reduce consumption. We need to live differently, but I think there's a long way to go. But what Russia has finally done with its war is forced us to go down a completely different road, which I think is not necessarily in Russia's economic interest. But we need to go down this road, and we have, and I think we've gone down this road much more quickly than some might have anticipated, including President Putin.
Excellent. Another question from the audience is asking you about your views on Brexit. And the question is it your view that Brexit has made EU integration easier?
Excellent question. No, I don't think so. For us, the UK was an important partner within the EU, at least from Luxembourg perspective. As I represent Luxembourg, it's not something that we were very happy about. Of course, the UK was a very special member state, not really wanting to integrate further on many issues. So yes, it's a very good question, because the immediate conclusion could be, now that the UK is out, integration should be easier. But I think in reality, this is not really the case. But at least from Luxembourg's point of view, we will continue to promote European integration. It's absolutely necessary. We will be able to do that without the UK, but it's not because the UK is out that now it's an easy ride to down a European road of further integration.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question from the audience about refugees and migration. As you mentioned, refugee quotas have failed. So do you think that there's a shift in opinion now in Prague and in Budapest and Warsaw, now that they're in the front line? And if not, how likely is it that a mandatory contribution scheme will be implemented to help those countries with the most refugees?
We were very unsuccessful with mandatory, trying to do anything mandatory on refugees. That was a complete failure that we have to admit to. But we see, and it's not nice to say, a very different reaction to taking up refugees from the previous refugee crisis to taking up refugees now from the Ukraine. It's a very different reaction. I don't want to speak for countries like Poland or Hungary. From the Luxembourg point of view, having these mandatory refugee scheme would have been the right way to go. We promoted this on different levels also when we had the presidency of the European Union to put such a scheme in place, because we are really of the opinion that we need to be solidary with refugees, those escaping really totalitarian regimes. But we've been more successful since the taking up Ukrainians fleeing the war, and that without mandatory quotas. So yes, two different crises and two very different reactions. In Luxembourg, we continue to promote solidarity with refugees. We have taken up many refugees from the Ukraine, but also from the previous crisis, Syrians and other nationalities. I think, with respect to proportion of the population, Luxembourg is one of the countries that has taken up per capita vast amount of refugees, and we're proud of it.
Okay, maybe two more quick questions for you. One is almost a little bit of a fun question. So what is one thing that you would like to submit to Canada's Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, since you have a Canadian audience here?
Submit to her?
A message.
A message.
In terms of...
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think a message, as she's a female finance minister, as I am, I think female finance ministers have a special responsibility in promoting gender equality, and I think she's a big promoter of that as well. So I think there's many things that we can do together, also at IMF level, for example, but also nationally, women supporting women also in the finance sector. I think we are very far on a global scale away from anything anywhere near gender equality anywhere, but also in the finance sector. I think there's lots of room for improvement. So I think together we can send the right messages. Like Madeleine Albright once said, there's a special place in hell for women who don't support women, and I'm sure the Canadian finance minister has the same position on this as I do. So on that, I look forward to working with her.
Excellent. Perhaps one final question, if you have time for one more. And again, I'm paraphrasing, is that we've seen a tremendous amount of unity on issues such as the pandemic, actually, and Brexit, as was mentioned. But then there are other issues where we don't have a lot of unity. You mentioned the migration crisis. So since the energy crisis is really going on right now, and I know that the EU was currently debating an energy price cap, right now. So what do you think the prospects are for unity, really, in terms of the energy crisis that's happening right now?
I think unity is absolutely indispensable. Unity within the EU. Price cap is something that has been discussed now for a couple of weeks, months. I think energy ministers are meeting today and I think tomorrow on this issue. It's an issue that is also discussed within the EU on heads of state and government level. So I think there will be agreement, perhaps a bit late, but better late than never on a price cap soon. But you're speaking, or the question was about unity. So yes, we need unity in the EU, but I think we need unity and solidarity beyond the EU, together with Canada, together with the US. And this is not easy on the energy subject. The liquefied gas that you do have in Canada, how can we get it to Europe? We need to work together to find the solutions here, because it's in everybody's interest, between our economies, between our societies, between our democratic societies, where we have so much in common and share fundamental values. We need to find the solutions together. We need to stick together, because the adversity we are facing on a global scale is tremendous. If we don't stick together, I think this world will be a very difficult place if we don't put our heads together, be solidaire, work together in unity and in solidarity.
Excellent. Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much, Finance Minister Backes, and thank you, the audience, for coming. So let's